The train's whistle cut through the morning air, long and shrill, signaling its departure from the station in just 4 minutes. Pearl stood at the edge of the platform, her fingers trembling as they gripped the worn leather suitcase, the weight of it heavier than its contents. Clutched tightly in her other hand was the ticket to freedom, to a life away from the shadows that had haunted her for 12 years. She had waited for this moment, dreamed of it even, and now it was finally here. The platform was bustling, people going about their business, but none of it mattered. None of it could compare to the ticking clock in her chest. The train would carry her east, away from the menacing memory of Vernon, away from the controlling reach of his family. It was everything she had longed for, everything she needed. But then came the sound of boots pounding the wooden planks, fast and hurried, growing louder until it was all she could hear. A voice called out, ragged, desperate, "Pearl, wait." She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She felt him before she heard him. Ezekiel Boone, the quiet cowboy who'd watched over her from a distance for the past 3 months. The one who had never asked for anything in return. His voice carried the weight of 100 unspoken words. And when she finally did turn, her heart twisted at the sight of him. Breathless, hat in hand, his face lined with a desperation that was foreign to him. "Pearl," he said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Please, just hear me." The wind picked up, pulling at her hair and the edges of her dress. The train's whistle sounded again, louder this time, reminding her that time was running out. The station master's voice echoed through the air, calling for all passengers to board. "I can't stay," Pearl said, her voice shaking, but the words felt like a weight on her chest, as if saying them might make them true. She had no choice but to leave. She had been leaving for 12 years. After all, leaving behind Vernon's cruel hands, the threats of his family, and the constant, suffocating fear that had ruled her life. Ezekiel didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at her as if she might disappear if he blinked. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I know what you're running from, Pearl," he said, "but you're not running toward freedom. You're running toward loneliness. Just like I did after Martha died." Pearl's breath caught in her throat, the pain in his voice echoing her own. But there was something else there too, something she wasn't sure she understood. She didn't want to understand it. She didn't want to need anyone. But then Ezekiel did something that made her pause. He extended his hand to her. "Stay with me, just for 1 week," he said. "1 week at my ranch. No obligations. Separate rooms. If after that you still want to leave, I'll drive you to the station myself and buy you another ticket. No questions asked." Her fingers tightened on the suitcase handle, her thoughts racing. His words were a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a storm. But was she brave enough to take it? Brave enough to trust him? To let herself stay even for just 7 days? "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Ezekiel's gaze softened, and for a moment he didn't speak. His eyes seemed to see through her, as if he understood something about her that no one else had ever bothered to try. "Because for 3 months, I've watched you try to make yourself invisible," he said quietly. "And for 3 months, you've been the only thing I could see." The words hit her harder than she expected, stirring something inside her that had lain dormant for far too long. Something soft, something fragile. She wanted to ask him more, to understand why he cared when she didn't even know if she could care for herself anymore. But the train's whistle blew again, cutting through her thoughts, and she looked toward the station, where passengers were boarding. The seconds felt like hours as she stood frozen, torn between the safety of escape and the risk of staying. The train was almost ready to leave. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and yet now that it was within reach, she couldn't move. Ezekiel took a step closer, his hand still outstretched. He didn't force her, didn't push her in any way, just waited. He didn't speak, only let the silence fill the space between them. And in that silence, Pearl's heart whispered a truth she wasn't ready to hear. She wanted to stay. With a trembling hand, Pearl finally loosened her grip on the suitcase. It felt like the weight of it was too much to carry anymore, like the burden of fear and doubt had become too heavy. She reached out, just enough to take his hand, her fingers brushing against his, and in that moment, she realized she wasn't just reaching for him. She was reaching for herself, for the chance to finally make a choice. The train's wheels began to grind against the tracks, the sound of departure growing louder as the seconds slipped away. She felt the pull of it, the pull to run, to hide from a world she had known for too long. But she stood still, holding Ezekiel's hand, and for the first time in her life, she chose something different. 1 week, she said, her voice barely audible as she finally spoke the words that would change everything. Ezekiel's breath left him in a rush, a quiet exhale of relief. As the train began to pull away, Pearl watched it disappear into the horizon, the dust rising in its wake. She had let the train go. She had let the only escape she knew slip away. And yet, for the first time in 12 years, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in far too long. Hope. As the train disappeared into the horizon, Pearl wondered if she'd just made the bravest decision of her life or the biggest mistake. Because trusting a man again felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The wagon ride from the station to Ezekiel's ranch was quiet, each mile passing with only the sound of the horses' hooves and the soft creak of the wooden wheels beneath them. Pearl sat on the bench beside Ezekiel, her eyes tracing the dust that swirled in the wind, but her mind was miles away, still back at the train station. She could still feel the weight of the decision she'd made, the uncertainty that clung to her like a second skin. The world outside seemed so vast, the land stretching in every direction as if it could swallow her whole. But within that vastness, she felt a small tether to Ezekiel. She hadn't spoken much during the ride, unsure of how to put words to the chaos in her chest. Ezekiel, ever patient, offered nothing but quiet companionship, his gaze forward, never once pushing her to speak. She couldn't help but steal glances at him. The way he handled the reins so gently, the easy rhythm of his movements. He was a man made of patience, and yet there was a certain sadness in him that she couldn't quite understand. "What made you come to the station today?" Pearl asked, her voice breaking the silence. It felt like the first real conversation they'd had since she'd agreed to stay. Ezekiel turned his head slightly, his eyes soft but steady as he replied, "Jedediah told me you bought a ticket. I couldn't let you disappear without trying." His words, simple as they were, settled in the air between them, a reminder of the depth of the choice she had just made. She noticed for the first time the quiet strength in him, the way he never rushed, never seemed to hurry through the world. "You've been kind to me," she said quietly, looking down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "Why?" Ezekiel's voice was low when he answered, "Maybe I'm tired of being alone. Maybe you look like you needed someone to be kind. Maybe both." She didn't respond, but his words hung in the air, and she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. The ranch came into view just as the sky began to turn from gold to a muted purple, the last traces of daylight slipping away. The house was small and simple, but it had a quiet, well-cared-for feel to it, like it had seen more years than it looked, but had never been left to decay. There was a barn nearby, a couple of horses grazing in the field, and a small, overgrown garden that hinted at a life lived in solitude. When Ezekiel stopped the wagon, Pearl felt her heart tighten. She had imagined this moment for so long, but now that she was here, it felt real. Too real. Ezekiel didn't rush her, didn't say anything as they got out of the wagon. Instead, he simply led the way to the front porch, where 2 rocking chairs sat, one of which was unused. Pearl couldn't help but notice how everything around her was so meticulously cared for. There was a tenderness to this place, despite its solitary feel. He motioned for her to follow him inside, and she hesitated only for a moment before stepping through the door. The inside was simple, too, but it was warm in its own way. A small kitchen with a hand pump well, a wood-burning stove, and 2 bedrooms, one of which was already neatly made up with clean linens. The other room, Pearl assumed, was where Ezekiel slept. She didn't ask. "This is peaceful," Pearl murmured, taking in the space. Ezekiel gave a half-smile. "It's quiet. Not sure if that's the same as peaceful." He showed her to the larger of the 2 rooms. "This was Martha's and mine." "You take it," he said, his voice steady, but Pearl could hear something else beneath it, something unspoken. Pearl started to protest, but Ezekiel shook his head. "You're the guest here. A guest gets the best room." There was no argument in his tone, and Pearl knew better than to insist. She let him bring her a fresh basin of water and a small pitcher of oil for the lamp. He even helped her with the linens, making the bed as he went. "One week," he said softly. "No expectations. You want to help with chores? That's fine. You want to rest? That's fine too. And if you wake up tomorrow and want to leave, I'll hitch up the wagon and take you straight back to the station." She turned to face him then, her heart pounding. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Ezekiel's gaze softened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes seemed to see right through her, to the parts she kept buried deep, the parts she had locked away for so long. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone. Maybe you just look like you needed someone to be kind." There was something in his eyes, something that made her breath catch, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to understand why he cared about her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded silently and sat down on the edge of the bed, her fingers trailing along the soft, clean linens. Ezekiel's voice broke through the quiet. "You're safe here," he said, as if reading her mind. "You don't have to worry." His words felt like a balm, soothing the rawness of the fear that still clung to her, even though she had stepped away from it. But it wasn't just fear that held her in place. It was trust. She didn't know how to trust again, but something in the way he spoke, something in the quiet way he moved, told her that he wasn't asking for anything from her, that he wasn't like the others. She lay down, staring up at the ceiling as a quiet, unfamiliar feeling filled her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. She heard the sound of footsteps as Ezekiel left the room, and a part of her wanted to call him back, wanted to ask him to stay, but she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the house settling around her, the creak of the boards underfoot, the quiet rhythm of the night. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, she was afraid of that less than she had ever been before. Pearl woke in darkness to the sound of a horse approaching. Fast, urgent. Her heart seized. Had Vernon's family found her already? But then she heard Ezekiel's low voice outside. "Easy now, just passing through." The rider continued on. Ezekiel had been awake, watching, protecting, and for the first time in 12 years, Pearl felt something she'd thought was dead, the dangerous flutter of hope. The morning sunlight crept through the cracks in the curtains, painting the room in soft, golden hues. Pearl woke to the smell of coffee, a scent that seemed to wrap around her like a warm blanket. She blinked a few times, her mind slowly coming into focus, and for a moment, she almost forgot where she was. But the reality of the ranch, the quiet hum of life outside, soon settled in. She rose from the bed and moved toward the window, her hand lingering on the worn wooden frame as she looked out over the land. It was vast, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos she had known for so long. When she stepped outside, the world greeted her with a gentle breeze and the distant call of a bird. She found Ezekiel sitting on the porch, 2 tin cups beside him. He didn't say anything as she approached, just handed her one of the cups with a silent smile. They sat together, side by side, as the sun rose higher, casting its glow over the landscape. "This is my favorite time," Ezekiel said softly, his voice low and steady, almost reverent. before the world makes demands. Pearl nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. She didn't speak, and for a long while, they simply sat in the quiet, watching the world wake up around them. It was a peace she had forgotten could exist. As the morning wore on, they went about their tasks. Ezekiel tended to the horses while Pearl took care of the chickens. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this for years. And Pearl couldn't help but watch the way his hands worked, so gentle, yet sure. He seemed at ease in this place, in this life. She, on the other hand, still felt like an outsider, unsure of where she fit or if she ever would. As Pearl reached for a bucket of feed, her hand brushed against his. They both froze, their gazes meeting for a moment. And for an instant, Pearl felt a strange shiver run down her spine. Ezekiel pulled his hand back, but not quickly, carefully, as if he understood. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice rougher than usual. "I didn't mean," but Pearl shook her head, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft. "I'm just not used to gentle touch." There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but clear. It was a small thing, a touch, but it felt like a bridge between them, one that neither of them had expected to cross so soon. The day passed slowly, the rhythm of their work soothing in its simplicity. After the chores were done, they sat together again, this time on the porch as the sky began to shift toward dusk. Ezekiel had a quiet way about him, a kind of stillness that both comforted and unnerved her. It wasn't that he was distant, quite the opposite, but there was a calm in him that Pearl wasn't used to. Her life had been filled with chaos, noise, and anger, and Ezekiel's peaceful presence felt like a balm to the raw edges of her soul. She found herself craving it, even as she fought the urge to pull away, afraid of what it meant to trust again. The next day, a storm rolled in across the plains. The wind picked up, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and Ezekiel moved quickly to secure the barn and bring in the horses. Pearl helped, moving more efficiently than she expected, as if the storm itself had a rhythm she could follow. She watched Ezekiel work, his movements quick but measured, and then she turned to the barn, following him in. The first raindrops hit the ground with a soft patter, and the wind began to howl. Pearl felt a flicker of something deep inside her, something unfamiliar, a gnawing sense of unease. Then the thunder cracked, loud and sudden, rattling the walls of the barn, and Pearl froze. Her heart slammed against her chest as memories, long buried, began to rise. She backed toward the door, her breath quickening as the sound of the storm intensified. She could feel the panic bubbling up inside her, threatening to take over. Another crack of thunder, and she couldn't move. Ezekiel, noticing her sudden stillness, turned around. His eyes softened, but his voice remained calm. "Pearl, you all right?" She didn't answer, her chest tightening as the storm raged on. Another crack of thunder, and she dropped to the ground, her hands clutching her head as the memories took hold of her. "Please," she whispered, almost to herself. "Not the cellar. Please." It was a voice from the past, a memory that threatened to drown her in its suffocating grip. Ezekiel's voice reached her, low and steady, cutting through the panic. "Pearl, you're not in a cellar. You're on my porch. You're safe." His words didn't immediately quiet the storm in her mind, but they anchored her, pulling her back to the present. He crouched beside her, not touching her, but there, his voice a steady rhythm in the chaos. "There's the oak tree," he said softly. "There's the fence line. There's my roan mare in the barn, dry and safe. You're here with me, above ground, safe." Slowly, Pearl's breathing began to slow, and the panic that had gripped her chest started to loosen. She looked up, her vision still blurred with tears, and she saw the barn in front of her, the rain falling softly outside. She wasn't in the cellar. She wasn't locked away. She was here, in this moment, with Ezekiel. She could hear his voice still, low and steady, as he continued to describe the surroundings, grounding her in reality. "I'm sorry," she whispered when her breath had finally steadied. "I didn't mean to. No apologies for surviving," Ezekiel said, his voice warm but firm. He stood and helped her up, guiding her inside the house. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you inside. I'll make tea." The storm raged on outside, but inside, the warmth of the house and the scent of chamomile tea began to calm her. She sat in a chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, as Ezekiel moved around the kitchen, his movements fluid and easy. When he brought her the tea, she took it gratefully, holding it in both hands as if it could somehow hold all the pieces of her together. "They used to lock me in the root cellar during storms," she said after a long silence, her voice small. "Said it would teach me to fear God and obey men." Ezekiel's jaw clenched, but his voice remained gentle. "That's not God. That's just cruelty." The words felt like a lifeline, and for the first time in a long while, Pearl felt the weight of her past lifting, if only just a little. "I never told anyone that before," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," Ezekiel replied. "Your secrets are safe here." He sat down beside her then, and as they sat in the quiet of the evening, something shifted between them. She hadn't known it was possible to feel safe again, to trust again, but in this moment, with Ezekiel's steady presence beside her, she allowed herself to believe it could be true. That night, Pearl left her bedroom door cracked open. Not an invitation, a test. To see if Ezekiel would respect even that small vulnerability. He passed her door twice before bed, never slowed, never looked in. And Pearl realized she was falling for a man who understood that trust wasn't given. It was earned in tiny, patient increments. The morning after Pearl had left the door cracked open, a sense of quiet peace settled over the ranch, as if the world outside had slowed its pace to match the calm rhythms of the home they were building. Pearl awoke early, just as the first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, and found Ezekiel already on the porch, a tin cup of coffee in hand. The sun stretched across the sky in soft, golden rays, casting a gentle glow over the land. Ezekiel glanced up when he heard her footsteps, his eyes warm but distant, as if the silence between them had become as comfortable as breathing. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep, but carrying an underlying steadiness that Pearl had come to rely on. She sat beside him, taking the coffee he offered, and for a while, they simply watched the world come alive around them. There was no hurry, no rush, just a peaceful rhythm to the morning. As they sat, Pearl couldn't help but notice the way the days were slowly beginning to blend together, each one feeling a little more familiar than the last. It was as though she were learning how to be, how to exist without the constant weight of fear pressing against her chest. But as much as the calm was healing, it also left her vulnerable in ways she hadn't expected. It made her realize how quickly she had started to trust Ezekiel, how quickly she had started to believe that the quiet life they were building together could be real. But the thought was fleeting, quickly buried by the work they still had to do. After a quiet breakfast, Pearl helped with the chores as usual, tending to the garden while Ezekiel repaired a fence. They worked in tandem, the tasks simple and familiar, but each small task felt like another step toward a life she hadn't thought was possible. She had begun to settle into a rhythm with him, and it felt good. It felt like this place, this ranch, could become home. But as noon approached and the heat of the day began to settle in, a shift in the air told her something was coming. The stillness of the morning seemed to deepen, the winds changing direction, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Pearl noticed it first, the way the birds went quiet, the way the horses in the corral started to shift nervously. Ezekiel had sensed it too, for he had already begun to scan the horizon, his face hardening slightly. He wiped his brow and turned to her, his voice low and steady. "We're going to town later today. Need to pick up a few things." Pearl nodded, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into her stomach. Something was wrong. The atmosphere had shifted too suddenly for her to ignore it. and a part of her couldn't help but fear the inevitable. When they arrived in Broken Creek, the town felt smaller than usual, the heat pressing down on everything like a weight. The streets, usually filled with the bustle of small-town life, were quieter than Pearl remembered. The mercantile was busy, the shopkeeper behind the counter offering a half-hearted greeting as they entered. "Morning, Mr. Boone." "Miss Pearl." Mrs. Crane called from the corner of the store, her sharp eyes flicking over Pearl with an air of judgment she had long since stopped caring about. But something fell off today. The usual chatter had died down, and the townsfolk were whispering, casting glances their way as they moved about the store. Pearl couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on her, that the weight of those whispered conversations was meant for her ears. Ezekiel seemed to sense it too, his hands steady at her back, guiding her through the aisles of the store with quiet confidence. But just as they were about to leave, a voice from the doorway stopped them in their tracks. "Ezekiel, Miss Pearl." The voice was low and cold, and Pearl felt a chill run down her spine. Standing in the doorway was Jedediah, his face serious, his eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, motioning for them to follow him outside. "There's someone you need to know about," he said quietly, his gaze flicking toward the other townsfolk who had gathered behind him. Ezekiel raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but he followed Jedediah outside without a word. Pearl followed closely behind, her heart pounding with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. As they stepped into the street, Jedediah led them toward the far end of town, where a man in a gray suit was standing by the boarding house. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed too cold for the small town. His gaze lingered on Pearl for a moment too long, before moving on to Ezekiel. "Name's Clayton North," Jedediah said quietly. "Been asking questions about a widow named Pearl Blackwood." Pearl's blood ran cold at the mention of her old name. The Blackwoods, her past, the one she thought she had left behind, was coming back for her. "What does he want with me?" she asked, her voice shaky despite herself. "He's a bounty hunter type," Jedediah replied. "He's been asking about you since yesterday. Said something about wanting to talk about Vernon's death." Ezekiel's jaw clenched, but his voice remained calm. "Is he still in town?" he asked. Jedediah nodded. "He's at the boarding house with a couple of his hired men. He's been asking about you, Pearl. Says you're wanted for questioning." Pearl felt the color drain from her face as panic began to rise in her chest. She wanted to run, to disappear again, but she couldn't. She had made her choice. She had chosen this life. Ezekiel placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not without a fight." Pearl swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hadn't come this far to go back. Not to them, not to that life. But what could she do? She was alone, without protection, without anything to fight with. She looked up at Ezekiel, searching for an answer, but he was already moving toward the street, his face set. "We'll deal with it," he said, his voice cold, his eyes locked on Clayton North. The showdown was inevitable. As they approached the boarding house, Clayton North emerged from the doorway, flanked by two rough-looking men. His eyes flicked over Pearl, and for the first time, she realized that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a threat. She could feel the weight of it in the air. The real fight was just beginning. The tension in the air was thick as Pearl and Ezekiel made their way through Broken Creek, the small town where Pearl had tried to build a new life, one she now feared might crumble at the hands of the Blackwoods. Her heart pounded in her chest as they walked side by side, the whispered gossip of the townsfolk trailing behind them, their eyes following with judgment. Pearl held her head high, trying to ignore the whispers, but the weight of their eyes felt like a heavy cloak. She could feel Ezekiel's presence beside her, strong and steady, like a shield, and though she was grateful for his protection, a part of her couldn't help but feel like an intruder in this town that had never truly accepted her. She had come here seeking safety, seeking freedom, but now it seemed like those dreams were slipping through her fingers. As they reached the mercantile, Mrs. Crane, The shopkeeper's wife greeted them with an eyebrow raised, clearly curious about their newfound companionship. Pearl's stomach twisted in discomfort, but Ezekiel didn't flinch. He simply walked toward the counter, his voice firm and respectful. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Crane," he said, his gaze steady. "Pearl here's a guest, and I'll thank you to show her the respect she deserves." Mrs. Crane opened her mouth to respond, but quickly thought better of it, muttering something under her breath and moving on. The exchange felt small, but to Pearl, it was a signal that things were changing. She wasn't just the widow Blackwood anymore. She was Pearl Boone, and even if the town didn't fully accept her, Ezekiel was standing beside her, and that was something. But just as the relief from a minor victory began to settle, a more ominous presence made itself known. Standing in the doorway was an unfamiliar man, his eyes sharp and calculating. He was tall, wearing a gray suit, and his gaze immediately settled on Pearl. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with deliberate precision. "Pearl Blackwood," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "I've been looking for you." Pearl's stomach dropped, and she instinctively stepped closer to Ezekiel, her heart racing. She had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it felt like a blow to the chest. The man's name was Clayton North, and from the way he carried himself, Pearl could tell he wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily. "What do you want with me?" Pearl's voice trembled despite her attempt to remain composed. Clayton's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here on behalf of the Blackwood family," he said, his tone oozing with authority. "You're wanted for questioning regarding your late husband's death, and I'm sure you have some things to explain." Ezekiel didn't hesitate. His stance was solid, his presence commanding. "She doesn't have to answer anything," he said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes locked on Clayton. But Clayton only smiled, taking a step closer. "Actually, she does. The Blackwoods have rights, and they've made it clear they expect answers. You've been hiding from them long enough, Pearl. It's time to face your past." The words stung, and Pearl's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The past she had fought so hard to leave behind was standing right in front of her, and she was powerless to stop it. She had thought she was free, but this man, this face from her old life, was a reminder that freedom was never guaranteed. "I've already told you once," Pearl said, her voice gaining strength as she forced herself to face him. Vernon fell down the stairs drunk. "I didn't push him. I didn't help him either because he just finished beating me for burning supper." Clayton's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That's not what the family says," he retorted, his eyes narrowing. "The Blackwoods claim you took jewelry, money, supplies when you left. They say you ran." Pearl's anger flared, and she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I took what I earned," she said, her tone fierce. 12 years of servitude, of being treated like property. "I took what was mine," Clayton sneered, pulling out a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "They filed a claim," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're wanted for questioning, Pearl. You can come willingly, or I'll involve the territorial marshal." Ezekiel moved then, taking a step closer to Pearl, his body a silent barrier between her and Clayton. "You got a warrant?" he asked, his voice still calm, but his eyes hard with a determination that Pearl recognized. Clayton's expression tightened. "Don't need one for questioning," he said, his hand hovering near his holster as if testing Ezekiel's resolve. Ezekiel stood tall, unarmed but unyielding. "Then you've got no authority here. This is my land. Pearl is my guest. And unless you have legal writ, you're trespassing." The tension was palpable, and the air seemed to crackle with the unspoken threat of violence. The town had started to gather, curious onlookers drifting closer, watching the confrontation unfold. Clayton took a step back, his hand still hovering near his gun, but something in the way Ezekiel stood his ground made him pause. He gave one last look at Pearl, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low with menace. "And when I do, I'll have the proper papers." You'll come with me then, one way or another. Ezekiel's stance didn't waver, his gaze unyielding. You'll have to go through me first. Clayton sneered and turned away, his two hired men following closely behind as they retreated. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, though. Pearl's breath was shallow, and she could feel the storm inside her, the fear of what was to come. But Ezekiel's presence beside her, unwavering and solid, grounded her. He placed a gentle hand on her arm, offering her a quiet, reassuring squeeze. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered. Pearl closed her eyes, taking in a shaky breath. The threat hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Ezekiel wasn't just offering protection, he was offering a chance to fight. They didn't have to run. They could stand their ground. As they turned to leave, Pearl's heart raced with the weight of the decision she now faced. The Blackwoods were coming for her. They were coming for everything she had fought for. And with the threat of Clayton North looming over them, the real battle had only just begun. The days following the confrontation with Clayton North were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Yet through it all, there was one constant: Ezekiel. As Pearl settled into life at the ranch, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But Ezekiel's calm, steady presence seemed to steady her, grounding her in a way she hadn't known was possible. The threat of the Blackwoods, of the return of her past, loomed over them like a dark cloud. But every time Pearl looked at Ezekiel, she found a flicker of hope. He was strong, unwavering, and in that strength, she found a small measure of peace. It was the little things that kept her going: his quiet voice in the morning as they sat on the porch together, the way he never pushed her but allowed her to move at her own pace. As the days passed, their shared moments became rituals, small but significant. Morning coffee on the porch became sacred, a moment of connection in the midst of their daily work. Ezekiel never rushed, always allowing her time to adjust, to settle into the space they were creating. They shared the chores of the ranch, dividing the tasks between them without question. Pearl fed the chickens and tended to the garden, while Ezekiel took care of the horses and did the heavier work around the ranch. He was patient, teaching her how to handle the animals, how to mend things around the house. And though he never demanded anything from her, he also never treated her as if she were fragile. He respected her space, but there was no hesitancy, no fear of overstepping. He simply let her be. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, Pearl felt herself loosening her grip on the fear that had consumed her for so long. She began to laugh more often, even if it was just at a small joke Ezekiel made or the sight of a chicken flapping its wings in an unexpected burst of energy. She felt her body begin to relax, her shoulders uncurling from the constant tension she had lived with for years. The nightmares that had plagued her for so long began to fade, and when she woke in the night, she no longer felt the same crippling terror. She found herself trusting Ezekiel in small ways, letting him take her hand when he helped her with the work, allowing him to guide her through new tasks without hesitation. But trust, she knew, was still a fragile thing. It had to be built slowly, carefully, over time. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Pearl caught herself watching him. She had always been so careful about keeping her distance from men, always expecting them to hurt her. But with Ezekiel, there was no fear, no expectation of harm. It was strange, almost foreign, and it both comforted and unsettled her. As the weeks passed, their interactions grew easier. The small, accidental touches became less accidental, and the quiet moments of connection, shared laughter, gentle glances began to feel like something more. Yet, despite the comfort they were building, Pearl couldn't shake the nagging doubt that remained in her heart. She wasn't sure what to call what was happening between them, but it felt like something real, something worth holding on to. And still, she feared that the other shoe would drop, that she would wake up one day to find that the fragile peace they had built was nothing more than a fleeting dream. It was during one of these quiet evenings, after the day's work was done, that the question came. Pearl and Ezekiel were sitting on the porch, the air growing cool as the sun dipped below the horizon. They sat together in silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze. Pearl, feeling the weight of her thoughts, finally spoke. "Do you think you could love again?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ezekiel turned his head slightly, his gaze soft but unwavering. He was quiet for a moment, considering her question, and then he spoke, his voice low and honest. "I think I already am," he said, the words carrying more weight than Pearl had expected. Slowly, carefully, "But yeah, I think I already am." Pearl felt a lump form in her throat, the vulnerability of his words catching her off guard. She had expected him to give some guarded answer, some careful response, but instead, he had given her the truth. She had never expected this kind of honesty, not after all the years of fear and manipulation she had endured. For a moment, she couldn't speak, the weight of his words settling heavily on her chest. Slowly, she took a deep breath and whispered, "I don't know how to love." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. "Vernon taught me fear dressed as love. He made me believe that if I loved him, I had to obey him, submit to him without question." Ezekiel's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. "Then we'll learn," he said quietly. "Together. The real thing." His words were steady, filled with a quiet confidence that made Pearl's heart swell. "What if I'm too broken?" she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice making her feel exposed. Ezekiel's hand squeezed hers, and he looked at her with a warmth that made her chest ache. "Then we're both broken," he said, "and maybe that's all right." Pearl took in a shaky breath, the weight of everything she had been holding inside slowly beginning to lift. She had never imagined that she could have something like this. Something real, something built on trust, on time, on patience. But here it was, right in front of her. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't thought was possible: hope. The next day, as they sat together on the porch, Pearl looked over at Ezekiel and smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I think I'd like to stay the full week," she said, her voice steady but soft. Ezekiel's face lit up with a smile of his own, his eyes warm with something that might have been hope, too. "I like that too," he said. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping gestures. Just two people, sitting together in the quiet of the evening, beginning to understand that they had already chosen each other. That night, as Pearl lay in bed, she left the door cracked open again, not as a test this time, but as an invitation. She was ready to let him in. Slowly, carefully, they were building something together, a life, a future, a love that had to be earned one step at a time. But even as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still to come. Would she be able to trust completely? Could they both build something that would survive the weight of the past? The answer was still uncertain, but for the first time, Pearl allowed herself to believe it might be possible. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, Pearl and Ezekiel stood side by side, staring at the telegram in his hands. The bold letters on the yellowed paper read clearly, "Isaac Blackwood will be arriving within the week to contest the marriage of Pearl Blackwood, formerly of the Blackwood estate." Pearl's heart sank as she read the words, her hand trembling slightly. She had feared this moment would come, but the reality of it still hit like a punch to the gut. Isaac Blackwood, Vernon's brother, had always been a man of power and cruelty. He would not let her go so easily, not when she had escaped what he had considered her rightful place. Ezekiel stood still for a long moment, his expression hardening as he absorbed the implications of the telegram. "Isaac," Pearl whispered, her voice a mixture of dread and resignation. Ezekiel's hand tightened around the telegram, and his jaw clenched. "How much worse is he than Clayton?" he asked, his tone low and controlled. Pearl took a deep breath, steadying herself as she met his gaze. "Isaac is the one who holds the purse strings. He controls everything, and he uses the law like a weapon. He'll make sure no one in town speaks in our favor if it comes to that. He has money, and he will use it to break me." Ezekiel nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling in. "We won't let him take you back. Not without a fight." The determination in his voice filled her with a flicker of hope. For the first time, she felt like she was no longer alone, that there was someone beside her who would stand with her no matter the odds. But that hope was fleeting as the reality of the battle ahead took hold. The following days were filled with a sense of urgency as Ezekiel, Pearl, and the townspeople prepared for the arrival of Isaac. They gathered all the evidence they could. Reverend Matthews wrote a testimony, and the townsfolk rallied behind Pearl, promising to speak on her behalf if the worst came to pass. The bond between Pearl and the community deepened, and she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for these people who had come to her side, offering their support without question. Yet, the closer Isaac's arrival came, the more fear gnawed at her. What if they couldn't win? What if the law sided with the Blackwoods, and she had no choice but to go back to them, to that life she had fought so hard to escape? One night, the worry became too much. She couldn't sleep, couldn't stop pacing. The old house felt too small, the walls closing in as her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Ezekiel found her on the porch, staring out at the dark horizon, her arms wrapped around herself. Without a word, he sat beside her, the warmth of his presence grounding her in the midst of the storm of her thoughts. "What if they win?" Pearl asked quietly, her voice breaking. "What if they say I have to go back to him? To Isaac? What if they take everything away from me?" Ezekiel turned to her, his hand gently resting on her arm, a silent promise in the touch. "Then we'll run. Together. I'll sell everything, pack up what we can, and we'll leave. We'll go far away where they can't reach us." Pearl's eyes met his, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. "You do that for me?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "For us." Ezekiel nodded without hesitation, his voice steady and firm. "You are my home now, Pearl. The land, the ranch, it's just wood and dirt. You are my home." The sincerity in his words made her heart swell. She had never been loved like this. No conditions, no strings attached, just the simple, unwavering truth of it. "I love you," she whispered, the words spilling from her before she could stop them. Ezekiel's face softened, and he pulled her closer, pressing his forehead against hers. "I love you too, Pearl. I have for weeks now, have for longer than I realized." The simple admission made her heart feel light, despite the storm brewing inside. They held each other under the stars, finding a rare moment of peace in the chaos that was about to unfold. The next day, as predicted, Isaac Blackwood arrived in a carriage, his cold eyes scanning the landscape as though he owned it. Pearl's stomach tightened as she saw him step out, flanked by his lawyer and Clayton North, who wore a smug expression that made Pearl's blood run cold. She stood beside Ezekiel, her hand gripping his arm, though her heart pounded in her chest. Isaac didn't even acknowledge her presence at first, his attention entirely on Ezekiel. "Pearl," he said, his voice as icy as the winter wind, "you've caused considerable trouble for our family." Pearl's heart hammered in her chest, but she held her head high. "My name is Pearl Boone now," she said firmly, her voice unwavering despite the tremor of fear she still felt. Isaac's face twitched, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see about that," he sneered. "This marriage is fraudulent. You had to escape your rightful obligations." He turned to his lawyer, who stepped forward with papers in hand. "We're contesting the validity of this marriage based on claims of coercion and fraud. Pearl Blackwood was under no legal authority to marry without her family's consent." Ezekiel stepped forward, his presence a shield between Pearl and Isaac. "People aren't contracts, Isaac. You don't own her anymore." Isaac's eyes narrowed, and he sneered. "In matters of family debt, they are," he shot back, his tone biting, "and she will fulfill her obligations." Pearl's blood boiled at his words, but she didn't flinch. This time, she was not the frightened woman who had fled to the train station. She was Pearl Boone, and she was ready to fight for the life she had built. "I married Vernon at 16, she began, her voice strong and steady. "For 12 years, I was beaten, controlled, and treated as property. When he died, drunk and violent to the end, I was finally free. I ran because staying meant more abuse from his family. From you, Isaac." Isaac's lips curled into a smirk. "You owe us," he said coldly. "You're bound by duty, Pearl. And if you refuse to return to the Blackwoods, there will be consequences." Pearl stood taller, her voice never wavering. "I owe you nothing. I survived, and that is not a crime." The lawyer stepped forward again, attempting to assert his authority. "We will contest this marriage. It is a matter of family honor." Reverend Matthews interrupted, his voice booming with conviction. "This marriage is legal. I married them according to the law, and there is no fraud, no coercion." The community, once silent, now rallied behind them. Jedediah stepped forward, his weathered face hard but resolute. "This woman has lived here peacefully for months. She's harmed no one." Mrs. Crane spoke next, her voice shaking but sure. "Ezekiel Boone is a good man, and we all know it. This marriage is just, and if anyone threatens Pearl, they will answer to us." The townspeople gathered behind them, their support undeniable. Isaac's expression shifted as he realized he wasn't just facing Pearl, but a whole community that had come to her defense. He turned to his lawyer, his jaw clenched in frustration. The lawyer whispered in his ear, and Isaac's eyes darkened as he processed the advice. The lawyer finally spoke up, his voice clipped. "The marriage appears legally sound. Contesting it would require extensive legal proceedings with an uncertain outcome." Isaac's gaze flicked to Pearl, and he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't about the law, Pearl. It's about family honor. You disgraced us." Pearl met his eyes, her voice calm but fierce. "I survived you. That's not disgrace. That's strength." The standoff hung in the air for a long moment, before Isaac finally seemed to concede defeat. "This isn't over," he warned, his eyes flicking to Ezekiel. "The Blackwoods have lawyers. We will come for you. We'll find a way to make you pay." Ezekiel stepped forward, his eyes steady and unflinching. "Let them try. We'll be here, and we'll fight." With that, Isaac and his lawyer turned, their retreating footsteps marking the end of the confrontation. Clayton followed behind them, his face twisted in anger, but even he seemed to recognize that the fight was over, for now. The crowd that had gathered to watch erupted in quiet celebration, and Pearl felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. She was safe. As the tension dissolved into a murmur of congratulations, Pearl collapsed against Ezekiel, her body shaking with the adrenaline that had coursed through her during the standoff. "It's over," Ezekiel whispered into her hair, his arms wrapping around her. "You're safe." The townspeople offered their congratulations, and Pearl found herself overwhelmed by the kindness and support of people she had once feared would turn their backs on her. Mrs. Crane, wiping her eyes, gave her a warm hug. "You're one of us now, dear. That means something here." And for the first time, Pearl truly believed it. That evening, Ezekiel and Pearl rode home in silence, the weight of the day settling into a quiet peace between them. They didn't speak much as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Pearl leaned against Ezekiel, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I can't believe it's really over," she murmured, her voice soft with wonder. Ezekiel's arms slipped around her shoulders, holding her close. "Believe it. You're free. Truly free." Pearl smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Because of you. Because you stopped me at that train station." Ezekiel pressed a kiss to her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. "You stop yourself, Pearl. I just gave you another option." Pearl closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words deep in her heart. She had chosen this life. She had chosen him. And in doing so, She had chosen freedom, love, and a future that was hers to shape. "Best option I ever took," she whispered. The night stretched on, the stars twinkling above as they sat together in peaceful silence, knowing that they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, united, and ready for whatever came next. The fight had been won. The future was theirs.